Being an artist can be a heck of a ride, but you're not alone. On Journey of the Art, we tell inspiring stories of artists and chat with those who support us on this path. I'm your host, Lola Opataya, writer, editor, singer, and all-round lover of words. Come with me on the journey. Before we get into today's conversation, I want to take a moment to let you know that this podcast is also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. So feel free to listen on the go or download it for later. Hello, and welcome to Journey of the Art if you're new here, or welcome back if you've been around for a while. In this episode, I'm chatting with Uma Krishnaswami about her latest work, Birds on the Brain. The book tells the story of two young girls, Rini and Yasmin, who discover that people aren't aware of a global bird counting event. And when it seems that external forces want to shut it down, they recruit members of their community to spread the word and ensure that the event is a success. My guest and writer of Birds on the Brain, Uma Krishnaswami, has been writing for young readers for 30 years. Among her many titles are Book Uncle and Me, Step Up to the Plate, Maria Singh, Threads of Peace, How Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Changed the World, Monsoon, and Two at the Top. Uma is faculty emerita in the MFA program in writing for children and young adults at the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and many of her students have established successful writing careers. Welcome, Uma.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I am so delighted to talk about this book, Birds on the Brain. It's such a delightful read. I read the prequel, Book Uncle and Me, and I was blown away. And this book, just like the prequel, the readers learn practical ways to get involved in community while overcoming some great odds. So let's get into it. One of the things I love about your writing is how you show young readers that their voices matter. And not only that, but that for their voices to create effective change, they must embrace teamwork. And so I wanted to ask, why do you think this is an important thing for children to learn?
Well, I have to tell you that I came at this not so much from thinking about what children should learn from it, but more from an approach to story. I have always been resistant to the notion of the single character on a heroic journey.
Right.
Back in the day when I first started writing, this was back in the last century, and the hero's journey was the big thing in the Western writing world at the time. Everybody was embracing this. Star Wars was out, and I really tried. I tried to take the stories I was trying to write at that time and fit them into this mold. And they didn't work. They were not the kind of story I wanted to write. This was especially true with Book Uncle and Me. It was not about the single character on her journey, and she was going to come across obstacles and receive help in overcoming them. It was really about a community, and I was trying to bring a community to life. Right. So I finally quit trying to please everybody else, and I started writing to please myself. And I started really paying more attention to the characters, and that's where this really this idea became real for me in story, and it emboldened me to write the kind of story that I was interested in writing.
Right.
But to your question, I think this is very true of how we solve problems in the real world. There are heroic people who lead major causes, but none of the really hard work of life gets done by one individual.
Right.
And it is important for all of us to understand that. It's very important for young children to understand that. But I arrived at this through story.
Right. I really love what you said about characters and taking that mysticism around a superhero away from things and really just honing in on that character. And my next question is really about characters. And I want to ask about Book Uncle and the Istri lady. I hope I'm saying that
Hmm.
correctly.
Hmm.
So, Book Uncle loans books to children, and the wisdom that they extract from these books helps them to solve the issue at hand. And so, I think of him as a kind of healer who prescribes books to his patients. The Istri lady, on the other hand, is not as educated, but her superpower seems to be rallying support for community projects. And these two are elderly, but they play such a big role in helping the children achieve their goals. And so I wanted to ask if you could share a little bit about your intention behind these characters.
Yeah, the Istri lady. I am so happy to hear you zero in on her because there, my parents lived in Chennai in the south of India at the time that I was first writing Book Uncle and Me. And there was an Istri lady who had a little booth, and she was very loud and she knew everybody in the community and she would bring, gossip and stories from one place to the other. And she had this son whom she bossed around, and she had not been to school, but she was very quick on her feet,
Mm,
and I just found myself watching her and hearing what she said, and she almost really floated into the book and became this character.
yeah,
And of course, from that point on, this is fictionalized. But it just made me think about how education gets privileged
right,
sometimes, and
right.
that people who don't have formal educations in the Western sense, the way that we see it, um, really have a lot of wisdom of their own and ways of connecting with each other. And that the kids in this story, it seemed to me, had something to learn from both these ways of being in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is fascinating that you talked about the Israeli lady because I can also think about people from my home country who are not as educated but had so much power in the community. They were mostly women of commerce and they commanded a lot of respect. So I think it's wonderful that you brought that character to life. Another thing that stood out to me about Birds on the Brain and Book Uncle and Me is Book Uncle's motto: right book for the right person on the right day. And now, for those who haven't read your work, I should explain that Book Uncle is an independent librarian who operates from a book kiosk on a busy street. And so, this motto, right book for the right person on the right day, is something he's probably learned from serving his community over the years. And as I pondered this, I thought I'd ask if you think this can serve as a guideline for parents looking to help their children become better readers in our highly digitized world.
Yeah, right. So we are living in a world that's moving further and further away from print on the page and the book as an object, which is
Yes.
very much, of course, what I grew up with. But yeah, I think choice in reading is really important. That when reading becomes part of a curriculum, it becomes prescribed, then it starts to feel like medicine,
Mm,
and you don't feel like taking it necessarily. You resist it. I think it's interestingly for me, looking back on my own childhood, I was a an unstoppable reader. I was like Yasmin in Book Uncle and Me, and I would have absolutely wanted to read a book every day for the rest of my life if I'd had access to that many books, which I didn't. So what I did instead was I read the ones that I had over and over again,
yeah.
but I didn't have other sources of entertainment. I didn't have screens. I didn't have, and let's be real, the shining, moving pictures that you can, advance or change at the push of a button. These things are very, very attractive.
Yes.
But I'm also seeing I have young grandchildren now, and I'm seeing with my little granddaughter, who is now 3 years old, that if you put a pile of books in front of her, she can become absorbed. So I think part
Mm,
of it is um, get, allowing that access to the material.
right.
And then she's also very particular about what she wants to read. She'll pick up a book and then she'll browse and then she'll close it and she'll pick up another one. And even as young as 3, she has she has acquired taste for
Mm.
things. Now she's intrigued and curious. If you pick a new one up, she will go there. But I think part of the way this works in this context and for her is because that time is not competing with screen time.
Right.
Her parents are quite careful about how much screen time they give her, and then she also has access to lots of books. And I think that's the dilemma for Yasmin, of course, is that she's delighted to read, but what's going to happen to her when she doesn't get the books that she
Right.
needs?
Right.
But I do think that a choice in reading, adults choose what they read, so it's really unsurprising that when we let children do that, they do find the right book for the right day for
Right.
them.
Right. So, as the story evolves, and we're talking about Birds on the Brain now, we see that the three main characters have individual social concerns. Rini is passionate about avian conservation, Yasmin is passionate about community literacy, and Anil is passionate about solar power for faraway villages. What are some tips you can share to help children's book writers develop stories that help their readers become socially conscious?
I think for me, how do I do this? I write about things that I care about. I think I'm very deeply suspicious of new ideas when they show
Mm.
up in my mind. I send them away for the most part when they're shiny objects and I don't trust them. I don't know that a new idea is going to give me enough traction that I would want to work with it for the next year or 2 years or five
Right.
years or however long it's going to take me, because sometimes you don't always know. So I think we need, search your heart for the things that move you.
Right.
And then if you're writing for young people, think about where that connection might come for young readers. I had somebody ask me, so birding is not always seen as an activity for kids. Why birding?
Mm.
Well, it's because I'm interested in birds, and I also think that kids are closer to the ground than we are, and they do tend to pay attention to what's going on in the world around them. And there are things with wings and beaks up in the sky, so why not birding? It could have been anything else. But I think that the only child that you can really tap, the only child sensibility you can really tap if you are a writer for young people is lies in your heart. It lies in the child that you used to be. I have memories of my son. I have memories. I have now experiences with my grandchildren. I have done plenty of school visits. I can think about the idiosyncrasies and the expressiveness of the children I've encountered, but the only child I really, really know is the child that I used to be.
Mm.
So I think you put those two things together. You look at what moves you, and then you think about how young you would have dealt with that. And then, of course, you take into consideration, depending on when and where the book is set, you take the setting into consideration. You look
Right.
at, how people are consuming news, for instance. That became an issue in Birds on the Brain and in these books in general.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a
Right.
combination of all of those.
I really like that. And that really speaks to me, especially as I feel like I'm in a writing slump. Writing the things that you are passionate about, the things that speak to you. So thank you so much for sharing that. Another thing that I appreciate about the book is the reality of it. Rini's mother is a newscaster or a news reporter who uses her voice to share what's unknown to others. But on the other hand, we see that voice being silenced when she tries to report on lower bird numbers in a bird counting season because it makes the government look bad. And in doing this, you show the readers the cold reality that while voices can get louder, they can get silenced too. Is this something that you were intentional about?
It kind of happened in the course of writing the book, and I think it's because I was becoming aware of how this plays out in the real world.
Right.
One of the things I feel very strongly is that children live in the same world that we grown-ups inhabit, and they're not blind to its realities.
Mm.
And so as I wrote the story, I came to the scene, and suddenly it made sense that if Rini was having issues with getting the bird count to happen, or finding people who were interested in the bird count, that perhaps her mom was having issues with reporting on this story.
Right.
And that, of course, is something it's always a constant jostling in the media world about what news gets reported and what does not. But we also know that there are powerful voices involved, and that they can silence that news.
Right.
So yeah, it's sort of, I'm not a big plotter. I don't plot in advance. I write sort of synopses for myself of what I think, where I think the story is going to go, but I sort of leave myself enough open doors so that I can be surprised as I write. And in fact, this was one of those surprises that just came out of the writing process.
That is fantastic what you just said. And I just want to pull a thread on that. You said you're not a big plotter. And that goes against some of the things that I've heard, you know, structure your novel and have it, I guess different things work for different people, but the general thing that I've heard is, you know, plot your story so that you know where it's going, and you don't find yourself blocked at certain points because you haven't, you know, designed what the thing should look like. But I hear you saying that you're not so much of a plotter, and you sort of let the story take you where it wants to take you. So my question to you now is, how do you I guess there's a fine line between those two things, and how do you manage that fine line?
It is a fine line because you can't know nothing about it. And at the same time, I want to be surprised as I write. I
Right.
want story turns to come out of what I've already written, perhaps, even when I didn't anticipate them. And to me, those are the really wonderful moments of writing where you look back on something you wrote 2 days ago, and you think, oh, well, wait a minute, I've got this in here, and here's where it could go.
Right.
And if I plot all that ahead of time all the way to the ending, then I'm not going to surprise myself. So I really try to leave myself those openings. But the other thing is, I don't, if I write a chapter, I try not to end at the end of that chapter. I try to end my writing day by beginning the next scene or the next chapter, because that way it just takes me less time to bring myself up to speed when I come back to the work.
Right.
And I think so to that degree, maybe I'm plodding ahead just a scene at a time.
Right.
I almost want to tell myself every time I write that I'm not a novelist. I'm just a scenist. I'm just writing scenes one at a time. That's
Yeah.
all I need to do. I don't need to
Yeah.
know the ending yet.
Yeah.
And I for both these books, I did not know where it would end.
Wow.
Book Uncle surprised me by coming up with this wonderful theatrical big, celebration at the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
And so then it seemed logical that in the sequence to the sequel to the same thing would happen.
Yes.
But I didn't know that when I started.
And just out of curiosity, how long did it take you to write the first draft of Birds on the Brain?
Birds on the Brain did not take me that long. I was surprised. It took maybe about, I would say, 3 or 4 months, which is not, I'm a very slow writer. I'm a plodding writer. And some Book Uncle probably took me maybe 6 or 8 months to write. A really, really thin draft of, and then maybe a couple of years of revision. So I'm slow, but because I knew this world already, because I knew the characters, I knew the setting, I had tons of notes from Book Uncle to draw
Yeah.
back on, and then I had Book Uncle that I could read that book and look for clues that I'd planted in there that I could then expand on and lead into shaping these characters. But it surprisingly it wrote itself quite nicely. The book 3, which will be out next year, was another story, because I sort of expected it to be easy, and then it turned out to be not easy.
Oh no. And is this third book about Anil?
Yeah, of course it
Yes.
is.
Fantastic. Okay,
Yeah.
I look forward to seeing that. So let's go back to Birds on the Brain. And I want to ask about the importance of facts. And in the book, the book encourages involvement in social causes, but it also encourages the importance of checking facts and data. And we see Rini and Yasmin administering surveys and analyzing data. And I think this was such a great thing to include in the book in this digital age of information dump. And I wanted to just pick your brain a little about it. Can you talk a little bit about your intention with this?
Well, I needed to be quite honest, I needed to invent a project that this teacher would be likely to give to these kids. And of course, in book one, it's they all write letters, right? She
Yes.
wants them to write letters. So I wanted her to do something that would lead into the with time with the bird count somehow, where Rini would be able to connect those two things.
Right.
And it also needed to be something where they would go out and talk to people. And that's how I came up with the survey. I wasn't very sure that it would work. I thought, I don't want to get tied up in the weeds of this. Um, but then once I started writing it, it seemed to make sense. I then had to go back and figure out, what is it like to construct survey items, and pull on everything I knew about that, which was not very much. But it and then make it child sized so that it
Yeah.
would be something that kids could do. So this is an unusual teacher in that she has these very community based projects. It's not very common in Indian schools to have this kind of thing. So this is sort of an unusual school that these kids are
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
But it made sense from all of those perspectives.
Yes, I really appreciate you sharing that, and I that part really stood out to me because again, one of the things that I really love about this book, putting up here again, is it's really practical. I find the book to be very practical. How do you get children involved? And that may not have been your intention, but I think it makes for a very practical book for children who are looking to get involved in their communities. What things you need to consider. It's not probably not just enough for you to be passionate about something, but also find out what the facts are. How many people really know about the bird counting event, and why do they not know, and how do we convert those? I love what you said about converting people from the no's to the maybes, and then the maybes to the yes, and that was such a wonderful thing to include in the book. And then I want to talk about the point of conflict. Again, something that really blew my mind. And there's this point of conflict in the book where Anil is collaborating with people who want to build a solar system on a rooftop where a sunbird is building her nest. And knowing what will happen, Rini wants to save the bird and her babies, but Anil's project will save and help an entire community. And so the question of the greater good arises. And in the end, they find a resolution because Rini does not accept defeat on the matter. So when the situations align, she's quick to spot the solution. And I'm trying not to give away the story here, but it's almost as if your message here is never give up, right? And keep looking for those solutions. So I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that.
That is so important. And I love how you framed it, because I'm not sure I thought about this in such detail. What actually happened was I wrote a scene that never ended up in the book, but I actually put Anil on the rooftop and wrote it from his perspective, and saw the bird fly in, and sort of figured this is what's going to happen. But yes, and it just strikes me that children in our time are so deeply aware of exactly these kinds of conflicts, right? I
Yeah.
mean, we have seen the youth climate strikes that took over the news for so long. I've been following these cases where children around the world are suing their governments. Um, over their climate rights. I mean, this is like big stuff.
Yeah.
The kids are completely aware of what's happening in the world and of their place in it.
Yes.
And so to put this in the hands of kids and make Rini face that. They do tell you that one of the things you should do in writing fiction is make your character suffer, right?
Yeah.
So this was Rini's suffering. She
Yeah.
needed to face this, and also face the fact that perhaps she hadn't been listening to Anil as much as she thought she had. She had
Yes.
been so obsessed with her viewpoint that she hadn't been paying attention. It wasn't until she saw how deeply concerned and upset he was that it occurred to her that she ought to maybe start listening to him as well.
Yeah.
And isn't that the point at which we start communicating with each other?
Yeah. 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 I really loved that part of the book as well, where she stopped to recognize that, oh, the same thing happened with Yasmin. I didn't listen to Yasmin, and now I'm not listening to Anil. So, and I think it's such an important detail to include, especially like you said, in this world where we are very aware of, you know, all the things that are happening. Are we really truly listening to one another? So this affects me and that affects you, but are we listening to one another? And maybe we cannot find a way forward until we are both truly listening to each other. So that was one of the things that I really loved about the book. And page 69 of the book has my favorite lines in the book. And I just want to ask, is it okay to read a portion of it?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
And so,
page 69.
Page 69, are you there? Yasmin, I say, 1 out of every 8 species of bird on Earth is threatened with extinction. I know this for a fact. I saw it in a TV documentary last month. The number was awful that it stuck in my mind. That's how urgent this is. Now do you see? And this is my favorite part. She hesitates. Then she nods. She sees. And I see something too. Sometimes you just have to slow down and give people reasons to see. When I read that, I stopped and I put my hands on my computer and I was like, I have to talk about this, but I don't have a question. But this is so good. And I think that it really summarizes the spirit of the book so well. And so as we bring this to a close, I want to ask, what would you say is your number one tip for children's book writers who want to help their readers slow down and see?
Oh, wow. What's my number one tip? That is a great question. I have to think about that. I think it's about attending to feelings in a story, because you can have a story with lots of action and lots of things happening,
Right.
lots of excitement. But the thing that we remember at the end of any book that you can think of is how to make you feel.
Right.
And so I think that the way to make readers slow down and pay attention is by giving them that space in the writing, to catch a breath and think about what's just happened or what they just read or what it all means. And I think Yasmin says that in book 1, and so she's really speaking for me, I suppose, in a way. The point of the book is not what happens at the end. It's what does it mean is the point. And I think those meanings that we carry away are always deeply connected to how a story makes you feel. And so that's what I would do is make sure you've got breathing points in your narrative, that allow a reader to either fill in gaps for themselves, so you're not spelling everything out. That's a common mistake that beginning writers make when they're writing for children, is to sort of underestimate the audience and connect all the dots. And you don't need to do that.
Right. That is so helpful, because I'm plotting something. Well, not really plotting, because again, like you, I'm not much of a plotter. the vision is in my head. I kind of know where it's going to go, but there is so much room for the story to take me anywhere it wants to go. So that is very helpful for me. And I must admit that a part of me is being a little selfish in the questions I'm asking, just because you've been doing this for 30 years, and it's wonderful to be able to glean from your wisdom. So I just have one more question before I let you go. How long have you been teaching for?
I taught for 16 years at Vermont College of Fine Arts in the MFA program in writing for children and young adults. And
Okay.
I started teaching at a time when, I don't have an MFA degree, but I practiced this work for a long time.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, so throughout your experience, what would you say is one thing that stops children's book writers from going forward? As you've read several things and met with several writers, what would you say has been their number one stumbling block?
I see, actually, I'm going to say there are two things that I see that stop people. One is when they keep trying to please other people.
Right.
When they're responding to editors, they're responding to peer groups, they're responding to critique, and they lose sight of why the story mattered for them in the first place. So
Right.
that's one thing. And then the second thing, which is its exact opposite, is when people don't listen to any feedback on their
Mm.
story, or they um, or they become defensive about that. So I think there's a fine line there. You have to be completely committed to your vision for a story when you're drafting it, and you have to revise fiercely
Mm.
when you come to revision, and critically. And then at that point, you need to open your mind to all possible criticism that you might encounter with a piece. So that's that whole two minds of a writer thing,
Yeah.
that I think is really important,
Right.
particularly when we write for children, because we can't only write for ourselves.
That's
There is
correct.
an audience out there, and we have to be aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah. That is such a great tip. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for coming to chat with me today. I am so thrilled about this book. I'm going to leave the links in the show notes and the description for anyone who wants to get it. Birds on the Brain by Uma Krishnaswami. And thank you, Uma. I wish you much success with the book.
Lola, thank you so much, and much success to you too.
Thank you. On the next episode, I'll be chatting with another inspiring artist. But before then, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you think about this show and this episode. Feel free to drop me a note here or send me a DM on Instagram at Journey of the Art Pod. Finally, please subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or follow and rate the show if you're listening elsewhere. Help me connect with other artists who need a dose of inspiration today. Until next time, stay on the journey of your art.